Hi everyone, welcome. I'm not sure who can hear me yet, so I'm just going to give it a few seconds just to cycle through. I know it can take a little bit of time to get onto the system, so I'll just waffle at you in the meantime. But welcome, if you can hear me, if you're all coming on. I don't know, we've been talking about maybe we should have some little hold music in the meantime. Maybe I should do some kind of storage dance. What's a storage dance? Don't know. But whilst you're all coming in, I'm just waffling away until you can actually hear me. Yeah, whilst you are coming in, if you can hear me and we're waiting for other people to start, then maybe just introduce yourself in the chat, say hello to people that you've been on the sessions with for the last couple of days, because I think hopefully many of you will have been to several of the sessions, and maybe talk about, maybe you could say what the favourite bit of your event has been so far, if you've been to some of the previous sessions. Just have a chat about what you particularly enjoyed. Might help us for next year as well. If there's anything that you'd like us to do again, I guess what my favourite bit be, maybe the sustainability podcast has been my favourite bit to do so far. It was quite good fun. Always nice to have a chat with your colleagues and then have it recorded and broadcast to everybody. So that was quite a nice highlight for me. But yeah, if you've got anything that you're particularly interested in that you liked, put it in the chat and let us know. But I think maybe that's enough waffling from me. Shall I make a start? Producers, are we okay to go? Excellent. Okay, well, we've only got an hour and we've got lots to get through, so I will make a proper start for everyone that's on. Welcome, nice to see you all. Thanks to those who've been at the session so far. If this is your 5th session, then well done for sticking with it. It's excellent. If you're new and this is your first one you've come to, then welcome. It's really nice to see you. So this is day 2 of our marketplace, our Electricity Storage Network Annual Marketplace. I'm sure many of you are a bit bored of this intro by now, so I'll just quickly, for those who are a bit newer, talk through who I am and what we're doing here. So I'm Madeline Greenhalgh. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Regen and the Electricity Storage Network. The ESN is the UK's network for electricity storage, the key is in the name. We're a broad, diverse membership with a broad aim to create an environment in which storage can flourish, the policy environment, the regulatory environment, the market environment, really supporting that net zero transition. And we're managed by Regen. So Regen is not-for-profit with a broad mission to decarbonise the energy system, and we look across the whole system at Regen, and storage slots quite nicely in the middle. So that's us, that's who we are. This is our annual event that we run every year and have been doing so for at least 10 years or more. This is the 2nd time we've done it online, and these sessions are available to everyone for free. And the way we're able to provide them for free is by thanks to our amazing sponsors. So thanks to Fluence, to Schneider, to Modo and to Fritz for their support in allowing us to host this 2-day session, 2-day marketplace this year. Really quick housekeeping, just as we're online, I know many of you have heard this before, but you might be joining on Hoover on the platform, or you might be joining on Zoom. Either way, you can access this session in exactly the same way. If you're on Hoover, you do get a little bit of quite a lot of additional functionality. You can chat to other delegates, have a look at our previous content, have a look at our on-demand content. So there's lots to do. So if you're on Zoom, absolutely fine for this session, but might be worth checking out the Hoover platform to look at some of those additional content and rewatch the sessions if you want to. Q&A, you can do it in both Zoom or Hoover, we'll get it either way, but please do try and put your questions in the Q&A box and leave the chat for just chatting, because then it's a bit more difficult for us to get the questions out of the chat. And I can't take any questions through the raise hand function, unfortunately. It's just a bit logistically difficult. So please do type them into the Q&A box and hopefully I will be able to get to them. So that's enough waffle, got all that out of the way. I'm just going to quickly talk to you about what this session is today before we get to our speakers. So what are we doing today? We're doing a bit more of a techie session today. We're doing a bit more of a diving into some of that data. So I think one of the themes that's come up in the last few days and many storage events is that storage has to make use of a variety of income streams, and arbitrage and the balancing mechanism is one of those. So not only does that help make storage income, but it also helps National Grid to balance the system close to real time. But I think it's quite fair to say that storage and other newer flexibility services behave in quite a different way to what the BM is used to, what the balancing mechanism and the control room are used to. Normally they're controlling quite large fossil fuel assets. So whilst it is a great income stream for storage and for flex, and it's a great way to balance the system, it doesn't often work that well for those newer, smaller types of assets. And how do we know it's not working that well? Well, actually, it's quite difficult to tell because they're historically operated in quite an opaque way. The control room, generally, you know how it works because you know someone there and you've been in the industry for a long time and you know how these things work. That has been changing a lot in the last few years in the industry, and give the National Grid electricity system operator credit where it's due. They've been doing a lot that they can to make the decisions much more transparent. Actually, last year we had a session where Rob Rome, who's the head of National Grid, came and ran a whole session with us about looking into the control room and what the control room does. So we're getting there. It's definitely getting a lot better. And last year, there was quite a bit of pressure from the industry and from us as members to produce a data set from the ESO, publish a data set which gives insight into control room decisions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the key complaints from our members is that they're often skipped. So skipping, we'll come to that in a bit more detail, but it's being dispatched, not being dispatched despite being the cheapest and most efficient asset in the merit order. So this data allows us to look at when those assets are skipped and why they're skipped. And it's actually given us many of the insights alongside that too. So we're really getting our teeth into this quite tricky data set today. We're going to give you some insights into the findings from that data and discuss with our panel what that data can tell us about how we dispatch zero carbon flexible assets in a net zero world. So I've got two amazing panelists that are joining me today who are absolutely experts on this data. We've got Alistair Martin, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Flexitricity, and Adriana Martins, who's the Junior Data Scientist at Arenco, two companies that have got much experience of the balancing mechanism and how it works. So they're going to share out their insights into this data set. But first, my colleague Bruce Barnsley, who last year gamely stepped up to the plate to analyse this very complex data set. And he's going to take us through what he's found so far and some of his insights into that data. So Bruce, I will hand over to you. And then once Bruce is finished, we'll do our panel session and reflect on Bruce's findings.
Thanks, Maddie. Hey, everyone. Good to be here. Fate brought me to the balancing mechanism last year when I joined Regen. And since then, it's been really good to, get some idea of how the system is balanced. Definitely learned a lot. So today I've got a quick presentation on what I found and talking a bit about the dispatch data itself, how much insight it gives into the balancing mechanism. So I'll just give a quick rundown of the balancing mechanism itself. I'm aware there's probably quite a wide range of understanding on how it works. So at any point in time, supply must equal demand on the electricity grid, and the control room are responsible for ensuring that. And so the day is split into half-hour settlement periods, and electricity is traded from years ahead of real time up to a point called gate closure. And this is 1 hour before the start of the settlement period. So it's at this point in time that all trading stops and the balancing mechanism comes into effect. And here the control room will be dispatching assets, so telling generators to increase or decrease to balance the system. So the process in a bit more detail. At this gate closure, each asset on the balancing mechanism will submit to the control room its final physical notification, which is informing the control room of how much it's generating over the settlement period, if it's going to be increasing, decreasing, or just staying level. And it will also submit bid offer data. And this is, well, an offer is a price it would take per megawatt hour to increase its generation. And a bid is a price it would take to decrease its generation. So with this information, the control room will then try to dispatch the assets which most cost effectively balance the system. But as we'll see, a lot more comes into this decision, a lot more than just the cost of the dispatch. So as Maddie said, this whole process of dispatch has historically been very opaque. Not many people know what goes into these decisions. And this is starting to change now because system balancing is becoming a far more important topic and a far more expensive activity. So the ESO are making efforts to increase operational transparency, and this balancing mechanism dispatch data is one part of that. So it comes in two stages. You have a first stage, which is just a database of every single dispatch on the balancing mechanism. So which asset is dispatched at what time, and the volume of energy. So again, an offer would be a positive volume and a bid would be a negative volume. A price for this energy, and then you get into some rationale for the dispatch. You have flagging, and you have a second stage of analysis, which I'll come to. So first, let's get into the flagging. So every single dispatch is put through this first stage analysis. So what I've got here is a breakdown of how many actions over this March to December 2021 period were given each flags. Starting with merit order. So these are the dispatches which are taken, which are just purely the cheapest asset available. Then we have an energy flag, and this accounts for half of all dispatches. So it's not just a dispatch which is meeting the balancing volume requirement, but it's also satisfying some energy need of the system or of the asset itself. And there's a level of detail in the energy flag. There's subdivisions of the energy flag. Say an example might be a asset which has minimum on and off times, so it can't be dispatched or changed in a certain way. The control room also will be positioning assets to be dispatched in other settlement periods. So again, a level of detail there, but not the time to go into that perhaps. Then we have the system flag. And this is when any engineering or system management requirement comes into the decision. It's 20% of all dispatches. And an example a good example is constraint management. So your grid can't physically take any more electricity. So some generators have to be turned down and other generators have to be turned up to balance the system. These actions would all be given system flags. So if you don't have a system or an energy flag and you're not the cheapest asset, then the ESO are taking these dispatches and putting them through another level of investigation, I guess. So dispatches with cheaper alternative actions will be passed on to stage 2 classification, where they're given reason codes and they're also compared with potential alternative actions. And one of the main points we came to when we first looked at the data and gave some feedback to the ESO over summer was that if transparency is your aim here, then the system flagging and energy flagging means that really you're not getting that much transparency into alternative actions. So here we're only seeing 7% of dispatches actually being compared with some potential alternative actions. And then also since the summer, since we first looked at this data, the number of system flags have been increasing, and that's come at the cost of merit order dispatches and stage 2 dispatches. Okay, so that was stage 1 flagging. And actually quickly to come back to that, there's also been some confusion because traditionally it's been understood that every single dispatch is either a system or an energy flag. But in this data, the case is that some actions are flagged and some are unflagged. But anyway, back to stage 2 classification. So again, unflagged actions, and they are not the cheapest available. So the ESO gives them some additional rationale. We have flexibility, frequency, incomplete, and zonal management. Flexibility is when an asset is dispatched, which may be easier to change or adjust. So say you have a fast-acting asset with high ramp up or ramp down rates, the control room may need that even if it's more expensive. Alternatively, the control room may want to save that asset if they think they'll need it later. So that's maybe a double-edged sword of being highly flexible. Frequency is a decision taken in the control room to maintain system frequency. So it's taken on a very short timescale. They don't have very much time to act. So perhaps they've dispatched an asset which is more expensive than an alternative. Incomplete is where they've tried to gather a load of smaller assets, smaller volumes to meet an energy volume, but they haven't managed to do that. And so all these assets are skipped. And then finally, zonal management. So zonal management is to do with the systems in place in the control room and how they work. So they have different desks which balance different sections of the grid, and these desks work semi-independently. And in the methodology for this data, the ESO explained that in busy periods, in times of system stress, the communications between these desks may be compromised, so you may get some more expensive assets being dispatched than if a whole national optimization were to have taken place. So that's a good insight into how the control room is working. But for zonal management, it's one to pick out because it's by far the most expensive reason code. Because we have this comparison between a dispatch and its potential alternative, you can look at the cost of each reason code. So as you can see, significantly more expensive than the others. And it's also significantly more common in the data. So it's used more as a reason. One of the issues that we have with the data is that these reason codes are often used in combination. So an action can be tagged flexibility, frequency, and incomplete, and then you're left none the wiser as to why this asset was skipped. So sticking with this stage 2 data. So again, this small section of data where there's a comparison with an alternative action. You can look at an asset skip ratio. And so I've defined an asset skip ratio as the number of times it appears in the stage 2 data over the number of times it's dispatched in the stage 1 data. So I guess a caveat here is that the absolute value of these ratios isn't as material because you're comparing a very large chunk, a very small chunk of data with the entire dispatch data. But the relationship between these ratios is interesting. As you can see, batteries and gas peakers have the highest average asset skip ratio. And then we have gas over here with one of the lowest average asset skip ratios. And I've continued this on this thread by looking at the balancing mechanism unit type skip ratios. So treating each asset type and calculating their averages. So there are 4 types of asset on the balancing mechanism: transmission assets, distribution assets, which are called embedded, and then we have supplier and secondary. And these, so most batteries are supplier units, and there's also very few secondary units. As you can see, the trend is the same. You have far higher skip ratios for these supplier or secondary units than transmission or distribution units. And also you have quite large changes in the monthly averages of their skip ratios. So I think that's enough of the fine-tooth detail of skips. Definitely something that's interesting, some interesting trends there. But on a more general level, this data has allowed us to look at overall trends on the balancing mechanism. And to get this analysis, I've combined it with the balancing mechanism unit register, which is an Alexon database. So once you do this, you can look at the different technologies being dispatched and see their energy volumes. So you can see that gas is by far the most, well, by far providing the most energy on the balancing mechanism, provides 85% of balancing energy. And then other technologies have secondary roles. Wind is used to curtail and bids, and this category here, not available. This is one of the bugbears. In the balancing mechanism unit register, there is no category for batteries. We are lumped in with gas peakers, so you can't really separate them out very easily. I suppose you could, but you would be doing that manually. Maybe I'll do that one day. Another issue with the kind of detailed data we have is in location. So we have GSP group given for assets, but any asset on the transmission level has no location data. And this is where most balancing energy comes from. So if you're trying to get an idea of where energy is coming from and going to on the balancing mechanism, it's very hard to do that. Well, impossible with this data at least. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the analysis I've done with this data. And my conclusions really are that it appears comprehensive, covers 350,000 dispatches from March 21 to the present day. There are minor gaps, but again, a lot better than we had before. If you combine it with the balancing mechanism unit register, you get some useful insight into trends, and the reason codes do give a view of some of the processes in the control room. Again, it's a small window, but it's a window nonetheless. And the methodology does have limitations. Transparency is the aim because of this system and energy flagging. They justify the majority of dispatches, and for these dispatches, you get no comparison with an alternative action. But then when you do have this alternative action data, you can have a look at skip ratios. You can get a vague idea of how different asset types are treated. And finally, if you're looking at overall trends, you can demonstrate the reliance on gas for balancing energy and the scale of growth needed in low carbon dispatch if we are to operate a zero carbon system. So that's all from me for now. I'm looking forward to further discussion, but thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bruce. That was, always super interesting to hear that, and I really commend Bruce for the work he's done on that, because it is not an easy data set to look at, and well done to everyone that's kept up with that. It's hard stuff. This is one of the most difficult things that I think I've done in the energy sector. It's one of the most technical, complex parts. So you can look back through that and have a look at it again. I think it's worth a number of looks into this information. But like I said, we have two experts here today, Alistair and Adriana, that know more than most people about this kind of data, so hopefully they can give us a few more insights into it. It's interesting that when Bruce analyzes the data and when Regen does it, we come at it from a point of, well, what does this mean for the system? Like, what does it mean for batteries as a group of types of asset? What does it mean for flexibility in general? But of course, Alistair and Adriana are looking at that, but also from they've got assets of their own. So very interesting to hear their views from how this is affecting their own businesses and their own assets and how this data is useful. So I'd like to come to you both just first, just to say hi, and if you could just give us a few reflections either on Bruce's presentation or some of the findings that you found in the data itself. So Alistair, if I could come to you first. Hello.
Yeah.
Nice
Hi
to see
there.
you.
So hi. Nice to see you. And thanks for the intro. Thanks, Bruce, for that presentation, which involved a lot of digging through quite a lot of data. Anyone who's had a go at that data set will know that that was a pretty hefty piece of work to analyse. Just one point of clarification: flexitricity. We don't have our own assets. We make a point of not having our own assets. So we're only ever exercising other people's assets in things like the balancing mechanism and the frequency and wholesale markets and reserve markets. Nevertheless, it remains our job to go out and get the best return for our customers, and therefore this really matters to us. The first thing I would say about this is that just as it was quite a bit of work for Bruce and Regen colleagues to take this data set to the results that he's been able to pull out, you can extrapolate that back that and try to imagine what a job of work it was for National Grid ESO to actually produce this data set. Classification of actions is very difficult. Now, Grid has had a duty under the BSC, there is the Grid Code, it's Grid Code, I think, to BSC, to classify, to do the flagging that Bruce talked about, system flagging and energy flagging, or rather system flagging, to mark out those actions taken in the balancing mechanism which are related to constraints. That part has been manual, but according to certain rules. And even then, after years and years of practice, there are still instances where people call them out and say, you got that one wrong. And it's quite important. There's big fiscal effects of that. Look at this, where a far more subtle set of breakdowns has been made, and far more complex concepts are being introduced to explain why certain things occurred. And as I understand it, this has been done in code. This is done automatically, and that's not straightforward at all. So I think we have to acknowledge the enormous job of work that went into this. Anyone who wants to understand it has an awful lot of work to do to actually get to the bottom of what's going on. But I think that the most important point here is that we all have a responsibility to do that, even though it's hard. They've given us our homework. They've given us everything we could possibly ask for in terms of information. We've got to get stuck into this information and pull the nuggets out. And there are a few. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think most people who have got plenty of assets running in the system will be digging into this data from their own perspectives, but also from a general perspective too. And yeah, like you say, Alistair, there's a lot to look at, but I think it can give us so many insights. And I think we'll talk about this later, but there's this two-way thing as well, where, like you say, it's a bit like VAR in football. A decision was made, and you want to use VAR to try and understand whether that was the right decision or not. But also it helps us to tell the ESO, what we think about what we can do for them as an industry as well. Like if they don't quite understand how batteries and flexibility are able to operate, we can change that by using this data. So good point, Alistair. Important for us to do that so we can give ESO the right information too. So Adriana, if you got any, what were your reflections on the data? Anything particularly useful that you found?
Yeah, hey, thank you, Madeline and Bruce, first of all, for having me. Always good to have a discussion on how flexible assets can lead to our net zero goals, especially when it's backed with real data. So as Alistair, I just want to make a correction that we don't own our assets anymore. We did back in the days. We, as Flexitricity, manage our clients' assets. And again, it's from our benefit and our clients' benefit to make the most out of the trading. And yeah, so going back to the presentation, I wouldn't have done a better job. So I think, having looked at the data, I think Bruce did an amazing job summarizing everything. It was very interesting, or I think well done for National Grid to getting it out. It was part of their promise to be more transparent. And I think, as Alistair said, it was great to have this data. However, I think there's a few points and there's a lot of constructive feedback on things they could work on. A few points that were mentioned on the presentation, and I think they really surprised us at Arenco, was the amount of energy flagged actions. I don't think that comes from, for example, Elexon. So we've only known system flags. That basically means a lot of actions are actually not in the whole merit order in the competition. Obviously, we can go through those constructive feedback points later, but overall, I think it was a massive improvement to get this out. And yeah, happy to discuss it further. So go ahead with the questions, Madeline. I'll give it to you.
Great, thanks, Adriana. Thanks both. So yeah, okay, I guess let's. There's some questions in the chat as well, which I think are touching on some good points. So this idea of skip rates, which I mentioned at the start, and Bruce has showed the skip rate ratio, and of course that was kind of one of the key reasons why we wanted this data, because we wanted to understand why if assets were being skipped and why they were being skipped. So I just wonder if you could give us a bit more info. How has this data helped you understand your skip rates? Do you think they've improved since we've seen this data? Is this a useful way of, could you just explain maybe a bit more about skip rates, perhaps, if you looked into them? Alistair, have you got anything?
Yeah, can I jump in on that? I might be to blame for coming up with the term skip rate, which National Grid really hates. But my goodness, it's catchy, so we're having it. But when we started to look at this, the skip rates were through the roof. We just weren't getting action, and we knew that we should be getting action. The process of looking through and understanding that the ESO has gone through was accompanied by, I think, quite deep engagement with their own control room people in trying to ensure that basically to chase out any residual habitual activities or favorite power stations, or only go for the big stuff. And I think that we did see an improvement as a result of that activity. In fact, I'm certain that we did. We saw it in the numbers, because we measured skip rate ourselves in a simpler form long before the data came out. And our numbers couldn't reflect the subtlety of reasoning that we get in the reason codes, but they were at least an indication. And if the trend was downwards, we were happy, and if it was upwards, we were sad. And we did see that engagement resulted in a reduction in skip. But there's a long way to go. Since the publication of this data set, what's probably confused matters somewhat is that dynamic containment came along. And particularly for batteries, there was a brand new fun activity, a new game to play. And when you are offering that dynamic containment, you are not available in the balancing mechanism in the same way. You have some availability because as you know, a state of charge varies, you can make yourself available for charges and discharges to tune that, so that you don't have to do it so much on the baseline. But that's quite restricted compared to what a battery in the balancing mechanism will do. At a time when the balancing mechanism is the favoured economic choice for batteries, and that occurs often enough still, batteries will fizz with activity in the right circumstances. But when you've got dynamic containment that is basically smacking that market out of the way, then you don't have data to actually do your comparison on. And that came about at a similar sort of time to the opening of this particular data set. So we've got a little bit of catching up to do. The changes in dynamic containment frequency has brought some batteries back into the balancing mechanism from time to time, and that means we're getting more of information about that now. A couple of other things to say about, well, first off, system. It is important to look at system flagging as well, because system flagged actions can also be competed against by resources that help to deal with the same system constraint. And we've actually seen quite a lot of skip in areas where we have a resource that could alleviate a transmission constraint. So that one is an issue for us, and that one is not have been reducing. So something that can deal with north-south wind flows and keep more wind on, being neglected in this process. And the other thing, I noticed that wind has popped up a couple of times in the Q&A. We think, in fact, we're pretty sure, we've done a correlation on this, there is more skip on windy days. Now, correlation is not causation, but one aspect of this is that on windy days, people in control room are working quite hard and quite to the wire. And so if the IT systems don't facilitate efficient automated decisions, gathering everything together and dispatching as one, if they don't do that, then the human beings don't have time to do it. So you have a problem there that's not solved and needs to be solved by IT. So there's value in IT investment in grid control systems. This is something that I raise whenever Ofgem gets strict on grid's IT budget. Investing in IT saves money in many times over in other areas. So extremely keen to see that. Those are the two things that I would just add. System is important, and IT is really important.
Yeah. I think that point about, we can possibly come back to that point about wind. I think that's kind of that, it's a nugget of why this data set is so interesting. If we can look at high windy days, maybe that gives us, this data set can give us a bit of a picture of what flexibility should or could look like, or shouldn't look like, in fact, when we go to a high renewable system. So I think it's useful to pick those little bits out and understand what was happening on this day, and that this data set has been helpful to do that. Adriana, any thoughts on skip rates, or anything else that you've done with the data?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I guess the trend that flexitricity seen is the same as the one we've seen in Arenco, but I guess I'll try to speak more in terms of numbers. So we've actually, when we started doing that automated BM trading, we were looking at around 80% skip rates. I actually just checked the numbers with some colleagues at Arenco, and just to emphasize that, like, the definition again, skip rates mean that 80% of the times we were submitting a bid and an offer, 80% of the times we weren't getting picked, and National Grid was getting more more expensive bids and offers. So actually, during the period after, until DC kicked off, we did in Arenco a quite good work with National Grid, trying to, having open conversations, push them to really pick us, like, we are here, we can be useful. And we managed to bring the skip rate down to 30%. Funny enough, in Arenco, we tried to use the inverse of skip rate. So we actually use market efficiency, which is literally the inverse of it. Anyway, but yeah, after a year of DC, we've seen the skip rates just going up the roof and back to those 80 to 90%. So I think this goes back again to Alistair's point, which is, I don't think we should blame the control room. I understand that it's still a manual process. So especially in windy days, when there's massive constraints, it might be easier just to pick a big asset that tends to be a CCGT and get it over with, especially because it's a half an hour process. But I think there's been proof, especially this work we've done previously with skip rates with National Grid, there's been proof that these small assets combined can be of great use for National Grid, and definitely cost efficient, because the skip rates just show that we are cheaper, we are more cost efficient, but we're just lower in terms of volume. And I think one main benefit of flexible assets currently is that we are more in number than we were in 2018 when we did that work with National Grid. So I guess if this automation comes in the control room, there's, I guess, no excuse, because we are small, but we're not smaller in number anymore. So yeah, and I guess just to add one more point, sorry, Alistair, I think this data set just came to prove that the skip rates and the preference for bigger units is not only for our assets, but in general to smaller assets that again tend to be flexible assets, which is what we need.
What I wanted to add, there's one thing you mentioned, when as people using flexible assets grow in number and size, one of the skip categories one of the stage 1 categories, Bruce, keep me right, is incomplete, where
stage 2.
That's stage 2. Right, so that's so it's the one that comes after flagging. So that's okay, right. So that's my stage 1, because there's another stage beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, right, okay, nomenclature, no matter.
Methodology.
Yes, so that process of identifying whether or not you have enough small assets to give you the 50, 100 megawatts that you need, or whether you have to take the 100 megawatts because that's in a lump and you have to take all of it. Basically, that becomes less of a problem the more people there are in the market, right? So small small participants in the market help all small participants in the market. So people who come into this and launch, whether they're doing batteries or something else, and enter the market and offer BMUs that are little, the more little BMUs there are, the more that incomplete flag is, or that incomplete separation is not going to be a problem. So that's just an encouragement for others to join the party, so that it becomes more fun.
Yeah, always open for people to join the party, for sure. And just to pick up on Adriana's point about But this isn't anti the control room. We're not saying that, we're not trying to bash them over the head here and criticise them. It's been really good process actually in getting this data to work with them and say, that's why they're putting it out there. And we're looking and saying, well, actually, here's some stuff that you might not have seen. Here's what we're finding. Here's our perspective from our side of it. And let's work together to improve that. So none of this is saying they're making awful decisions and we hate them. This is definitely like a constructive process. We've had some really constructive conversations with them about it. So we're definitely, this is teamwork, not us trying to sort of criticise them from the outside, for sure. I just wanted, we touched a little bit on kind of those reason codes and the location element of it as well. We talked a bit about that. Bruce, I just wondered if you mentioned that zonal management part was one of the biggest reasons for one of the highest cost of reason code. Could you just, do you have anything else to say on kind of that part of it? Why do you think that is, or what's it telling us when it's such a high skip for zonal management?
So again, zonal management's when an asset has been dispatched, which is more expensive than a competing asset because it's been dispatched from a different desk in the control room, and these desks are operating semi-independently. The communication between these desks might not be perfect, especially when it's busy system stress events. So I guess zonal management is a kind of measure. If there's loads of zonal management reason codes coming up, it shows that the system in place, the infrastructure of dispatch, isn't really up to scratch. But I guess reducing that relies, again, like Alice has said, on IT investment. But it's just for the control room to change their systems. It's quite a big ask. Security of supply. They're very conservative in any change because they want to mitigate against all risk and ensure security of supply. So,
but Bruce, I mean, I think that's changed. Changing. And the project that ESO has going on now with the control room of the future, and the even more, that's public. You can look at their slides and their minutes.
I found so I saw that report, but didn't see anything on the control room itself changing.
Right, but if what that falls into is a job of work that's being, should we say, overseen in some way by the Technology Advisory Council, which again is public, and you can look at their slides. And if you look through that, you will see a job of work associated with this umbrella term of net zero operation. So the ability, not net zero, zero carbon operation, not net, actual. So that's where Grid develops the capability to run on nothing but nukes, wind, solar, and therefore not making any use of CCGTs. Whether the market does that is not the point. The point is that Grid needs the systems to be able to achieve that. And that includes external stuff, like the stability pathfinders and all these things. It also includes a bucket load of internal stuff on the IT side. Certainly what I feel, I mean, I do have to respect what they're doing here, and I do respect the time that it's going to take to get it right. And actually 2025 isn't that far away, folks. I think that this is, when you compare this to the likes of the sort of distribution side, or heaven help us, the gas side, this is miles ahead. So this is actually showing the way for everybody else in my view. And there is, so that the IT work is happening.
Yeah, Adriana, if you've got anything from a data scientist perspective, is there anything you'd like to see improve in the control from the IT perspective?
Well, I don't think I have anything to add, honestly, because again, just to emphasize that it is, I guess this whole combination of smaller units that we are asking here, that we are capable to help you balancing demand and supply, just gather all of us together. That is a work that by humans is going to be hard. So we require that evolution within the control room. But again, as Bruce was emphasizing, the security of supply there's such a big risk if things go wrong, that I understand it takes it takes time and is a slow process, but having more automation within the control room, we think in Arenco, I think is a general comment that it will be key to bring the skip rates down. And we're going through the fourth industrial revolution. Digitalization is here, so it will be great to see National Grid maybe pushing forward towards that, especially in the control room, because this data is the proof that it's still a very manual process. And having this changing behavior with more windy days, higher skip rates, it's a human reaction to higher constraints. So yeah, nothing to add, honestly.
Yeah.
And automation, I think, is a term that means a lot of different things to different people. That control room of the future project is looking at right at the sharp and scary end of automation, with all of the conceivable tools of data science being considered as potential contributors to that. But right before that, there's a much simpler end, which is how can a human being make a decision efficiently? So you've got 50 things that can do the thing. How do you gather them together with one click? I want these number of megawatts, I want them at that speed, and I want them to be in this location, or I want them to not be in that location. It's just turn that into simple parameters, and that can be then passed to the machine that then goes and finds. That's a far it's a much easier problem to conceptualize. Adrian is right. That is actually deploying that in a control room environment. You still have to, you have to do a lot of testing, and you have to get that stuff right. Otherwise, a wrong dispatch can be quite destructive. But the fundamental concept of it is not reaching into particularly new tools. So that level of automation is already a big step forward, and that is within reach. And that is why I think people who are coming forward with flexible assets will. I think the 2021 showed people that flexible assets can be good earners, and 2022 and forward has the potential to confirm again that story with actually quite simple and easy to swallow improvements.
Yeah. I've just seen a comment come in the chat briefly about how the data needs quite a lot of cleaning up. Bruce, have you got any comments on, so we're coming a bit more to the end of the session, what would you want to see improved in this data? What would have helped you in your wrangling over the last 6 months or so?
I guess the main thing is not the actual dispatch data itself, but the Alexon balancing mechanism unit register. And I think it's widely known that it needs some work. We have around 5,000 assets in there, but only 300 of them actually come up in the dispatch data. You've got some inconsistent kind of naming conventions. Again, that issue around location of assets as well. Anything on the transmission network has no location data.
So yeah, that wrong as well. There are some actual mistakes in there too.
Right.
Yeah, and the multi-tagging as well can get very messy. So the reason why that unit wasn't considered in the merit order, you actually don't know when it's tagged with all the tags combined, and that happens quite a lot. But yeah, I do agree. As I said, there's obviously constructive feedback. We all have it, but it was a step forward, and there was a lot of information that we could access with this data set.
Yeah. I think that from what we've heard, that combination with other data sets would be, something. I used to work in data, so something that I'm always quite keen, a data standard that all those different data sets will adhere to, and then magically you can put them all together and it works quite nicely. At the moment, that's not an easy process. It's quite difficult to match up one data set with another and then be able to understand it. And I think, getting access to that fuel type data, so we can really say, well, do we know what kind of asset this is, and we know how high its carbon emissions are. So therefore we know how high carbon a certain day's dispatch was, or a certain month's dispatch. And I think that's something really important to analyse, to be able to say, well, what are you able to run that zero carbon system in 2025? At the moment, you've got 85% gas, so that's quite a long way to go. But it's quite hard to do that without that fuel type data, I think. So that kind of leads me on to my next point, just sort of finish up maybe in the last few minutes. Like, what do we what do we think this helps to tell us about how we can run a zero carbon system? Like, what do we think needs to change in the control room, and what does this data give us evidence to change to help us run that, to just be dispatching zero carbon assets, to be supporting those high windy days, etc. Alistair, what do you think?
The message is kind of very much getting through, I think, to ESO, and I hope we'll get through to DSOs as well, which is if you use what's being offered to you, no matter how small it is, people will build more of it. And if you ignore it, people who did build it will look silly and will move away to other markets. So what's offered to you, use it, take the step to get beyond the fact that what's being offered on day one is small, because on day two it's not small. But just by putting in that little bit of effort, you create a long-term dividend. And ESO gets that conceptually and is moving forward to delivering that. DSOs need to follow them down that track.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting next step to look at this at distribution. Adriana?
I would say this data really shows that there's still, I wouldn't say a long way to go, but there's still things we can improve in the way assets are dispatched in a control room. And I guess it's more a question to what we as market participants should do, because I feel like as Arenco, and I'm sure all the other flexible assets that fill and have these high skip rates, we try to show that we are available and we want to be more present on the BM, but it's just I guess the ESO to tell us how can we do that together. For example, we've as Arenco, after the industry letter from ESO during the COVID period in April, during those unprecedented market conditions, there was a letter that came out asking for help to manage the system during those times. We kicked off this trial, reserve from storage. That was a proof that we are active. We want to be participating and we want to help you achieve the net zero goals. We want to reduce your balancing costs. But I guess while we've had the trial, that service didn't kick off, but there's still a way to go. But I guess as flexible assets, we're here to try to get that done. So I guess it's just a matter of control room to tell us how to do it.
Yeah. I definitely think this is a two-way learning data set. It allows us to learn what's happening in the control room, but it allows us to be
a feedback loop, right?
Exactly. And
I actually just wanted, sorry to interrupt, Madeline, but just add a comment to the data set. I think there's been quite a lot of critics, and maybe I was the one starting with it with my constructive feedback comments, but in real life, I feel data is never perfect or as you wish. So considering all that I've seen, I feel that this data set is very far from imperfect. It has some content. Obviously, there are improvements, but it's not that I was expecting a first one go perfect outcome. But just wanted to emphasize it was an amazing contribution. And
Bruce, did you want to come in on that final point? What does this mean for, what has this told you about how we can dispatch zero carbon assets?
I think the reliance on gas at the moment, 85% of balancing energy, it shows that there's, again, quite a long way to go before we're operating a zero carbon system. But then you hope that with a sizable battery pipeline, more smaller assets coming in, and the ESO more able to use them effectively, this can change. I think that's maybe my main takeaway is the kind of scale of change that's required.
Just to, that was going to be my final question, but there's actually an interesting question popped up in the Q&A which I've seen, which is about would the grid take into contention the carbon intensity of those respective assets when dispatching? Might be quite an interesting point to finish up on if people have got what we've seen, the different reasons, and actually we didn't get that much into the merit order here, which might have been useful. What's that calculation of the merit order? How are things going up and down it? I think it's mostly cost, but what if we put carbon into that? What would that mean for the control room? Has anyone got any final comments on that?
I'm thinking maybe we shouldn't overcomplicate it.
Well, I guess at this point, considering that we have this manual process and it's just hard for them to deal with these constraints, I think it will just become even more expensive, because the units that they still pick, we will just have that carbon pricing on top.
Yeah.
If we have carbon pricing plus automation, then we were living on a perfect world. But yeah.
I would just add that when you look at carbon, you actually have to look at what's delivering the energy and how it performs, and what it's up to at the time. So today, for example, even today, which is not a particularly high stress day, Grid Scott coal units warming up for the peak, and they've done that a few times this week over this winter. Who wants coal now? We're doing it. We're warming them up from cold. You get a carbon penalty when you do that. You also get a carbon penalty when you take something like South Amber Bank, which has often been the largest loss unit, so had to be turned down. And when you turn down a CCGT, its per unit carbon emissions go up. So there's a carbon cost to margin. That's actually a really hard thing to measure. And that's why, yes, I'd like to overcomplicate it. That's the overcomplicated bit that I'd like to understand, but that's not a commercial activity. No commercial entity can undertake that analysis. That's for academics to go and build models that tell us that live and give us an absolutely crystal clear view of what the carbon associated with system operation really is. Because it might be that in a very low carbon system, and not zero, but very low carbon system, all the carbon that's there is there for margin. And that would be a very, very significant, if that were to happen, that would be a mistake, So avoiding that requires us to understand these processes. And I think there's room there for those who have the academic independence to go after that type of information.
Yeah, there we go. A call to any academics on here. I'd love to see it. I haven't seen any academics going into this data yet. Maybe it's a bit too soon, but if there are any academics on here, I'd love to see people who have a bit more time perhaps to spend doing a full paper on this. Would be absolutely
fascinating. You can get plenty of PhDs out of that data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There you go, Bruce. So it can be your next PhD. Brilliant. All right. Well, we're coming close to time, so I think there's tons that we talked about there. There's so much that we haven't got to talk about as well. That we were going to talk quite a bit about what this has told about costs as well, and those high balancing costs that we've seen and what we can tell from this data, but we didn't even get time to do that. So I think, and there's so much going on in the chat, so many questions, I do think there's an opportunity for further discussions on this in the future. So I'm not sure how we'll do that yet, but we're doing it within the ESN. So if you're a member, then we'll certainly be having this discussion many times in the next few weeks and months and years probably. So do join us for that, because that's something that we'll be doing. As Regen, we'll continue to analyse this data from kind of a system perspective, looking more broadly. We haven't got any assets, so we're not controlling any assets, so we're just looking at this as a slightly more neutral perspective perhaps. So we'll continue to do that. We are actually doing a project at the moment which Bruce is involved in, and looking at a day in the life of a net zero system in 2035 and what that means for National Grid and how they control that. This data set has been super helpful for us to try and understand what's happening now on those windy days and then kind of extrapolate that out. So we'll be publishing that, and that will be a really useful way of giving some context to this data. So look out for that. And certainly if Bruce is up for it and I've not scared him off too much by making him analyse this data, he'll be back and doing some more of it. This is a really complex topic, and well done everyone for sticking with it. We have got all this stuff recorded and online. Bruce's slides will be online, so you can dive into that and spend a bit more time getting to grips with it if you need to. And if you want to ask us any questions, then please do. So put them in the community boards on Hoover or pop us an email. That's also fine. So yeah, that's probably it for today, I think. We'll circulate all of this information after the discussion, so you've got it in your inbox. Our next session today is at 4 o'clock, so come and join us at 4, where we're going to be talking about fire safety, which is much more interesting than perhaps you might think. There's lots going on at fire safety. It's a super important topic for the ESN and for our members and for storage at the moment. So this is definitely kind of one of the hot topics of, oh gosh, that's a terrible pun, isn't it? It's one of the hot topics for storage at the moment. But my colleague Sophie Winnie will be chairing that session with Fluence, with DNV and London Fire Brigade. There's lots to talk about, and if you're members, then you'll be well aware of all these discussions, so please do come and help us and contribute at that session at 4 o'clock with Sophie. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Alistair, thanks to Adriana, and thanks to Bruce for all of your help and discussion today. We'll be carrying that on in the future. Thanks to everyone, and see you at 4 o'clock.